Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is AWS On Air, the startup show, where every single Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, or 4 a.m. if you're in Australia, we come to you live. We give you different tips, advice on how it is that you can build your startup in AWS, all with experts in all things startups on AWS. So I'll be here with you every single Tuesday. My name is Jillian Ford, and I am a startup solutions architect. And today's episode is all about building SaaS applications on AWS. And I've got some experts here who work with startups and companies of different sizes on all things SaaS. So let's do some intros. Ben.
Thanks, Jillian. G'day, guys. My name is Ben. I'm based down in Australia, in Queensland, and I'm a solutions architect with the ANZ startup team. I've been with AWS for coming up to 3 years soon, and prior to that, kind of ran my own startups for a good 18 years, so bootstrapped, venture-backed, and kind of scale out, and also a few failed startups along the way. So it's a pleasure to join today.
Fantastic.
You're not a startup founder if you don't have that track record, right?
Yeah.
Some of them are going to fail.
For sure. Yeah. And Bill, what about you?
Yeah. So I am fortunate not to be based out of Queensland, given that it's 4 a.m. there right now. Thanks, Ben, for getting up at 4 a.m. I don't know if I can do it. Right. I'm based out of San Diego, California. So it's 10 a.m. for me here right now. So this feels pretty comfortable. And I belong to a team called the AWS SaaS Factory. I'm a partner solutions architect, and our team talks about SaaS and helps companies on their journey to building SaaS on AWS. We provide direct enablement to help customers build. And we also provide a lot of scale initiatives in terms of some of the things we might see today, like reference architectures and shows like this, for example, Jillian.
Oh, fantastic. And every show, we do a little icebreaker warm up, because the reason why we do this live is we want to be able to answer your questions. So when you're listening here, you've got some questions, maybe you have questions in mind related to SaaS, pop them in the chat. We want to be able to answer them. But we're going to warm up those fingers. So type in the chat where you're from and what is your favorite thing to do outside of work. Bill, let's start with you. What is your favorite thing to do outside of work?
Oh, man. So this is a trick question, because if you have kids, it always has to be playing with your kids. But because that's kind of a boring answer, I'm not going to go with that. I'll say kayaking. I love kayaking.
Oh, cool.
I live in San Diego, so we can do it all year round. Just love being in the water and getting a little exercise. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Nice. Favorite thing to do outside of work lately, I live out on acreage, so we've been setting up like a bit of a permaculture farm, so planting lots of fruit trees. I recently got a new tractor, so I've been getting into kind of the agriculture and setting up like a bit of a tropical food forest with mangoes and avos and kind of large scale orchards. So that's what I've been doing kind of outside of work lately.
Oh, wow, that sounds so cool. We've got someone from San Francisco who plays with their dogs, and Mike Galpin, who has built his SaaS platform on AWS, has a question. Bill, do you play guitar?
It's only there to make me look cooler. I swear. No, I pick it up every now and then. I like to play. I'm not any good. We'll just leave it at that. That's all I had.
I mean, it's a great backdrop, so love it. And we've got some people, Lucas, Buxlau, Dilip, Mehara, welcome. Oh, another person who loves kayaking too in San Diego on LinkedIn. Awesome. So we've got a good little community of people here who have got some fun activities, and all things SaaS is what we're going to cover today. And so for people who aren't really familiar with SaaS, Bill, what is your definition of what SaaS is?
So it's very difficult to wrap your head around everything that could be SaaS. So I usually try to keep the definition as simple as possible. So SaaS is a business model, and that business model means you're going to have some sort of subscription-based billing, right? So this isn't software that you buy with a one-time fee. And that you manage as much of the software as possible on your customer's behalf. And then switching gears just a little bit, because I always like to get this in early, from the technical side. If I think there's one thing that defines a SaaS, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, the closest I've come is it has a control plane. Like there has to be some place that you can manage your SaaS solution from a technical perspective through a single pane of glass. And maybe not every SaaS should have a control plane. Maybe not everyone does. We can get some, if there's any dissenting opinions out there, but that's where I am with the SaaS definition right now.
Interesting. Ben, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think the SaaS model as well, it's just delivered kind of using cloud providers to a web browser, mobile app, kind of thin client. And I think these days, like what isn't SaaS really? Like long gone are the days of perpetual licenses and downloading software and installing it. So it's definitely kind of the default now. And yeah, it's quite fascinating.
And there was even a study I was listening to a podcast from YC Startup School. So Y Combinator, one of the most successful startup accelerators in the world. And they were doing some research of the top performing startups that have gone through Y Combinator and what are their business models. And actually the number one was SaaS. So it's definitely something, I feel like all roads personally lead to SaaS at some point. So many startups find their way to either building a SaaS product or maybe enterprises, maybe that Bill, that you've seen later on in their journey, they find some other product that they can build as a SaaS product.
100%. Yeah. It just leads to a lot of interesting roads, and every enterprise, every startup I talk to across the board is thinking about SaaS in one way or another now.
So Ben, what do you think really differentiates SaaS from non-SaaS? Because as we were talking about earlier, you've got some startups who come to you and they say, all right, this is my use case. I'm a fintech, I'm a healthcare company. Am I a SaaS company? So what would you say?
Gosh, so I think if you've got something like a repeatable app that you can serve like a global user base, and you're not kind of, installing a license or kind of install per customer on there. So something repeatable, that's, I think is kind of the key definition for me around SaaS on the platform side. And yeah, just in my previous experiences running a startup long ago, we used to sell like perpetual software that people would download and install on a license with yearly support. And yeah, long gone are those days, kind of selling software like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, SaaS is definitely the default delivery mode now.
Yeah, for sure. And so when that comes to how do you actually build that in AWS, there's a couple of different models. Maybe Bill, if you can walk us through what are the different options that really you see as best practices within AWS.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's some loaded terms here. I like to get these definitions out of the way early because there's a lot of different things people mean when they say multi-tenancy. Because, multi-tenancy and SaaS, some people think of them as fairly interchangeable. So we do talk about multi-tenancy, but there's a couple different ways you can deploy multi-tenancy. There's different tenant isolation models that you can use to apply multi-tenancy. And we use a couple terms. These aren't universal. These are terms that we've settled on our team within AWS. And I think they've got a lot of traction. So I'll use them. You guys could throw out other terms if you feel they're more appropriate, but I would call them silo versus pooled. And in a lot of ways, those are self-explanatory, right? You could think of silo as everyone gets their own stack. If I'm a SaaS provider, Jillian has all of her own infrastructure. Ben has all of his own infrastructure. I've got all my own infrastructure. And there may be some shared components, but to the extent possible, we've kept everything as completely independent as possible, right? So we still see this model. It's one of the easier lift and shift models to get to if you've got some legacy software that you want to transfer to SaaS. But the pooled model has a nice value proposition as well. And this is, sometimes we run into people who think SaaS and this pooled model are also synonymous, right? That you have to do a pooled model to do SaaS. So we like to sort of differentiate these two. Silo is still SaaS, but the multi-tenancy, this shared version, where in fact we're building services that all of us together are using, and at runtime, we're figuring out how to create the isolation in the applications themselves. That's really where SaaS is heading in a lot of ways for a lot of customers. And it's one of the things we'll tend to talk about the most because it is the most challenging to implement. It involves a lot of thought and planning to get to that pooled model. But yeah, Jillian, in answer to your questions, that's how I think about these different models. And of course, there's a hybrid model that you can throw in there as well. I throw that in after the fact because it's really just something in between silo and pooled, where you've got maybe a little bit of both flavors. And of course, then if you make that a range, there's a lot of different places you can land inside that range, right? Is it your web app that's shared? Is your backend applications, your database? Where are you sharing resources? And is that your model, or is that just, you know, exceptions? Or some of your tenants getting one model and others getting another? We can get into a lot of those as we talk a little bit more about it, but just setting the table, those are the two that I'd start with.
And Jillian, just wanted to share kind of through the developer lens, as being an engineer. So deploying a multi-tenant kind of the pooled model is a lot easier than managing, let's say, hundreds of individual installs on a silo model with certain software stacks. So the developer experience and kind of being able to ship product, I think, can accelerate in that pooled model.
I like that call out, because as I work with startups, I see especially startups who have never built SaaS products before. I think they struggle to wrap their head around really how do they actually do this, because they've never had to really think in terms of SaaS constructs of how do you handle multi-tenancy. So it's good to hear, I guess, from your experience for those who haven't built it before, maybe one advantage of using the pooled model you were saying. So I guess a question I have that I also see from startups I work with, if they are going into the actual siloed model, and we're going to show what an architecture and the code is going to look like soon. And but for those who may be thinking about, okay, I want to go with the siloed model, Bill, what do you recommend of like how they actually silo it? Is it everyone's in the same account, but it's siloed based off of the actual application, the architecture, right, or is it by each person gets their own AWS account?
So, I mean, you could actually interpret this some different ways, but when I think about silo, I think of it as a networking construct, right? So when I'm thinking about siloing one tenant's information from another tenant, I usually want to see some form of AWS networking construct in place. And that could be an AWS account. That makes perfect sense. In a lot of ways, that's the easiest thing to do. Not necessarily from a deployment perspective, but you get some nice advantages out of having your customers in completely different accounts. And I'll use customers and tenants a little interchangeably for anyone who isn't familiar with the SaaS terminology. For most of you, a tenant would be synonymous with a customer. There are some different exceptions out there, though. So tenants are more of a global term. Inside of a customer, it might mean a business unit. It might be your tenants. So I just want to make sure we identify what we mean by tenants. But going back to your question about that isolation model, account per tenant, a lot of ways is the tightest level of isolation, the least possible bleed in from one tenant to another. But it's not the only option. We also promote a VPC per tenant model. And again, VPCs are a very strong networking construct. It's not permissive by default. In other words, if Ben has a VPC and I have a VPC, those VPCs aren't going to talk to each other unless I set something up that says, yeah, these two VPCs can talk to each other. So it's sort of deny by default, if you will. So it's still a really strong construct. I really like to see that it may be the most common model. Account per tenant is still very common, but it can get a little unwieldy, and eventually you can run into some limits that we could talk about. VPC per tenants, I mean, you can have if you combine the number of accounts you can have times the number of VPCs you can have, it's almost unlimited. You're in the tens of thousands before you even start to run into any sort of limits. And that VPC per tenant allows you a little bit of an easier onboarding story. Your infrastructure as code story is a little bit simpler. Tearing down tenants, which, onboarding and offboarding are both part of our cycle, right? That offboarding story is a little simpler with VPC per tenant. And just to throw out one more, subnet per tenant is also something we have seen. It's a little less common because it's a little bit more permissive. Two subnets could potentially talk to one another if you don't properly set up the security groups and any knackles that are in between the two. So you want to be a little careful that you plan that out and thought through your strategy if you use subnet per tenant. But at least those three different silo models. There's probably others people could come up with as well, but off the top of my head, those are three.
Just to add some flavor to that, so dealing with some customers down in Australia, I see a bit of a like a multi-region silo model for particular use cases. So I might be a fintech or a healthcare life science company. I've got customers in Europe or the US or Australia, and I'll actually be deploying my my customers in the region that they operate. So it's kind of siloed, but within the multi-region lens. That's definitely a pattern, I think, it's quite common.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, it really shows that there's so many different options, and to be able to have a multi-tenant strategy, and it kind of really boils down to what best practices make sense to you, and maybe what does your team feel is the easiest, fastest, securest way to implement your multi-tenancy model. And that I think that decision kind of really varies based off of all different startups. I know a common thing that I see with startups when I talk to them about SaaS and multi-tenancy is once they get these concepts, they go, okay, how do I actually do it? How do I build a hybrid? Or if I choose pool because of the cost effectiveness for a lot of those early stage where being able to reduce their costs right now and preserve their cash is so important, I want to do pool. How do I actually implement it? So, and I think maybe the easiest way to actually explain how is if we go through maybe some code examples or any other examples that Bill that you have that can make that more tangible.
Right. Yeah, I think the first thing I want to do is I want to drop a couple links into the chat if you could.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And I know we've had some people I just saw in the chat from all over the world who are joining us. Abraham from Mexico City, Orania from Greece, Ben Kina from Algeria, Wissam from Paris, Olusegun from Brandon, Maryland, Dubai, Brazil. So cool. Today, if you joined in late, we're talking about how to build a SaaS application, build a SaaS startup in AWS. And the reason why we do this live is because we want to answer your questions. So please, as you're hearing us talk about these things, don't be shy. Pop your questions in the chat. Or if you have other questions related to SaaS that we haven't covered yet, make sure you just pop that question in the chat. We want to be able to answer them.
Right. Yeah. So I'll share my screen here. This is the first thing I want to show you. So if you don't remember anything else, remember that there's a GitHub repository that backs everything I'm going to show you today. This is all open source. It's free to use. We consider these reference implementations. In other words, this isn't a quick start. This isn't something you should go build your business on top of necessarily. It's an example of how to best implement the practices that we're talking about today. Not to say that you couldn't use this potentially as a starting point, but this isn't production code that we're promoting to say, hey, this is something safe to build your business on. And in fact, you'll quickly find, if you dive into this reference architecture, we've built out a lot of the core components, but a lot of the things that live around the edges of a SaaS, like metrics and analytics, for example, would need to be built out for you to successfully operate a SaaS business. So it's great. Definitely know that this exists. And that it's out there and available to you. And I'll be diving into a little bit of the code, but I mostly want to show you how this works and to dive into some of the services that allow it to operate in this way. This solution does come with 3 different websites. So there's 3 different front ends that back this solution. And they're CloudFront distributions. So again, this not being production code, this doesn't have DNS sitting in front of it, in part because it simplifies the process for us to set this up. You would have to actually own a DNS name and register it and refer it to Route 53, and then route that to CloudFront in order to make this really work for our website. We don't want you to have to go to that trouble to set this up. So all you actually have to do to get this started, and let me actually go back one page, is at the bottom somewhere here. This right here. I knew I'd find it. So you just have to find this one section. You create an AWS account, preferably a fresh one, so you're not, putting this into any of your production code, or a dev account that you happen to have. And you just have to run this one statement, and this will install this entire architecture for you. It's kind of nice. It bootstraps itself, and from there, it will set up 3 CloudFront endpoints that you have that have 3 different views of a SaaS application. And these are pretty common. You're going to have something like these if you run a SaaS application. One view is going to be your SaaS admin. When I mentioned before that a SaaS in some ways is defined by the control plane. Part of that concept is your administrators have to have a single pane of glass to be able to manage this application through. As your number of tenants grow, if you're actually logging into different accounts or finding different ways to reach all of your different tenant information, it's going to become untenable pretty fast. You're not going to be able to go and troubleshoot problems and find all the different experiences of your tenants if you don't have this. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in the admin portal today. I'll simply point out that there's a back-end way for us to add tenants as a SaaS admin through this application. So I could go and onboard some tenants. As you can see in this list, now this isn't going to be terribly performant on the front end. You're going to see some delays. It's, again, not really tuned up to be a production application, but you can see that I've already onboarded several tenants. So I've got some basic tier tenants and some platinum tier tenants and some premium tier tenants. And tiers are something we haven't spent any time talking about yet, but often you may be familiar with this already, right? If you use SaaS applications, you might see a free tier, a basic tier, and then perhaps an enterprise tier over here that says, call us for pricing, right? These are very common things we see when we see SaaS applications because there's different types of models that we want to support. And one of the nice things about this example that I'll show you today is the serverless reference architecture actually has both silo and pooled models built into it. So these different tiers of tenants that I'm talking about, the basic tier tenants are pooled. Everything that they use is going to be in a pooled infrastructure. And I'll talk you through several of those services that are pooled as we go through those examples. And these platinum and premium tier tenants are actually going to get their own resources. In addition to this admin portal, you also have what I would call a landing page, right? And this is to provide the opportunity for tenants to onboard themselves. This isn't universal. SaaS doesn't require that you be able to onboard yourself, but it is common to a lot of public SaaS models. And it would be something like this where you'd have an ad on your website, and you'd simply provide tenants the opportunity to sign in for themselves. And we could, right now set up something like a, Platinum 5. You have to provide an email address because there will be a fulfillment through an email address for our internal addresses. So mine, in case anyone wants to email me, billtar@amazon.com is my email address. I'm public facing, so you guys are welcome to email me if you really want to. I mean, maybe don't, but you're welcome to if you want to, if you got any questions.
Or your Twitter handle. I mean, I'm assuming that's what it is, SaaS Dog, because I think that's just the coolest Twitter handle I've seen.
Yeah, it's neat. Love it.
I've been asking them to change my email to that too, but they keep saying no for some reason. But Bill Tar is pretty easy to remember anyway. So, I mean, I could provision a tenant this way. I could provision them through the admin dashboard. But I've already provisioned some tenants, and hopefully I'm still logged in over here as this particular tenant. So you can see like the confirmation email I get gives me a user. So it's a default admin user that I can log in as. Let's see if it's still logged in. It might log me out. You never know. And let's see if it can bring up the products. If it can't bring up the products, it just means I've been signed out. Again, the experience overall of the there we go. It did come up. So I'm still logged in. And I'm going to show you something here. This is going to look ugly and scary, but I want to show it to you anyway. Just cover your eyes if you're not that technical and you don't want to know. But behind the scenes, all of the authentication that's done by the system is done with a JOT token. If you're not familiar with a JOT token, it's not essential that you need to be. But just think of this as I'm logged into this system, the system knows who I am and also knows what tenant I belong to. And this, I'll go back and explain this in some more detail later. But as we've said.
Yeah, Bill, can you just maybe increase the font size just a little bit, or the zoom in a little bit?
How's that?
There we go. Yeah,
better?
Okay, that's good.
Great. So a JOT token, if you're familiar with JSON, it's just a JSON blob that's signed. And it goes through our whole application based on how I logged in. So I didn't show logging in, but it's just like you'd expect. I put in a username and password, I logged in, and I got handed back this token. And this token is passed throughout my entire experience. And it's going to be very important to how we create isolation in this pooled model, and also how we route for our silo models, right? Because even our silo customers are still multi-tenant. They're going to come into our solution, and they're going to be routed off to the right part of the solution. So there's a few different aspects. I just want to highlight this. We'll come back to how this is created, where it comes from. It comes from Cognito. It's our identity provider. And I'll show you some of the pieces of Cognito. Now, in a short amount of time, I'm not going to be able to get into all of the details to how this works. I'll quickly throw out, we do have another show called Building SaaS on AWS on Twitch. All of those are recorded on YouTube as well. So if you're more interested in learning more and getting some more depth on this serverless SaaS reference architecture, we do have an episode on that. And it's an hour. The guys who wrote this go into a lot more detail. So if you're like, oh man, Bill talked about this tenant ID in your JOT token, I'm not there. I didn't capture entirely what he was trying to say. Feel free to go and dig a little bit deeper on this reference architecture and find out more about it.
Bill, what's what's the cadence of that show?
Yeah, so it's tomorrow. Tomorrow is our first episode in the new season. We have Armory coming on. They're a SaaS customer who built a continuous delivery as a service. So they're going to come on and talk about how they built the SaaS model that supports their Armory product. And it is then all right, some context. It's every week starting in March. For now, it's going to be every other week. And this is our East Coast North America EMEA-friendly time slot. So for me, that is 6 a.m. Pacific. So you have to do the math to drive off of that if you want to, or you can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn. Connect with me on LinkedIn, and then you'll see the invites as well. But then we're also going to have an APJ time slot, so Ben doesn't have to wake up at 4 in the morning. That starts a little bit later. We're going to kick that off in March because we're coming off of summer break in Australia and New Zealand. And that is run by a host out of New Zealand, whereas our other show is run by a host out of Sweden. So we cover almost the whole globe with that show. And once we get going in full season, we're able to switch back and forth fairly efficiently by going every week, just in different time slots, alternating between the time slots.
That's awesome.
Cool. So that was a mouthful. But anyway, connect with me on LinkedIn if that didn't make sense in terms of getting onto the show. Coming back to this, I'm going to jump out of this JOT token. I just wanted you to see that it's available. Understand that the tenant identity is baked into my entire experience. And that really is part of what we have to understand going forward. For now, this is just a standard application. For myself as the user, I don't even have to know that that's there. I'm logged in. I'm seeing this experience as if it was my own website. But we also know that as we come in here, I can create different... I'll just do this really quick so that we can see that this is a fully interactive example. I can create different products and orders. And it is pretty slow, again, on the front end of this. And I'll just jump out of here. I wanted to show that as you install this application, you can use it, you can create products and orders, and they'll go into the back end. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about the front end of this. I mostly want to focus on what's happening behind the scenes. And I don't have time to dig into all of the services, so I've picked a few core AWS services that I want to talk about and want to show. Let me jump all the way down to the data layer first, because it can be kind of demonstrative to show actually what's going on at the data layer. Now, we mentioned we have products and we have orders. Those are the two data domains that we have for our front end. And if you look in DynamoDB, you'll see a few different tables. Can you guys see this okay in terms of fonts and everything?
Yeah, maybe bump it up 1 or 2 more.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sean asked if this is recorded. Yes, so this is going to go onto YouTube. So definitely check out the recording. I know I certainly will, because there's so much here that maybe it can get easy to kind of just like miss as you're digesting it all.
Right.
Bill,
exactly.
I just had a quick question just on the web UI you were showing. What's that built in? Just out of curiosity.
So it's mostly Node. Right.
Okay.
So it's all JavaScript TypeScript front end. Interestingly, we use a lot of Amplify libraries as well. We're not really going to talk much about Amplify today, but just as an aside, if you're using Cognito, Amplify actually has some really neat libraries for working with multi-tenancy and Cognito and handling those JOT tokens. So those are baked into here as well. Now the back end is this is serverless, so it's mostly Lambdas we're talking about, is written in Python. So there's always something of a multi-language, multilingual aspect to SaaS, polyglot, if you will, especially in serverless. You have the opportunity to break stuff out. But in this case, it happens to be Python and Node that you'll find behind the scenes. Okay, so going to the tables, I want to call out these specific strings that you see right here. So you can see that we have some very odd sort of GUID looking numbers, right? Some unique IDs that are attached to these order tables. and also attached to the private, to these product tables as well. But then you also see, we've got these pooled tables. We've got an order pooled and we've got a product pooled. And again, this goes back to our silo versus our pooled customers. Our silo customers are each going to get their own tables all the way down to DynamoDB. And for our pooled customers, we're going to use IAM to actually create conditions that allow us to use a shared table. So let's open up one of the shared tables first. And we should hopefully have some data in here if everything went well. All right, the width of my screen is throwing things off a little bit here. Let me do this. All right, can you guys see that all right?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, there we go.
So now you can see that the shard ID that exists here allows us to have multiple tenants' data in the same table. So this is one technique of multi-tenancy where it goes all the way down to the data partitioning level, how we take our data and share that or split it up. So we've made a different choice for the two different types of tenants we have. For our pooled tenants at runtime, we're going to use IAM to set up what we call dynamic policies. Again, not going to be able to get into enough depth today to really talk about dynamic policies in general, enough to say it's a runtime isolation pattern that allows any of these tenants to only see the data in these shared DynamoDB tables that they should be allowed to see. And because IAM sets up those tenant boundaries, we can be assured that no tenant can accidentally view another tenant's data, even though they're in this shared table. So I'll quickly show a little bit later some of the code that supports that, but we're just not going to be able to get to a full depth on that. We also did an episode, by the way, I'm not plugging the I'm not here to plug the show, Jillian, but we did do an episode on dynamic policy generation as well. So you could also look that up. And I actually did that one. That was one of my episodes. So you can check that out as well. And jumping to one of these other product tables that are specific to specific customers, this one doesn't have any products. And neither does this one. Let's look at orders, perhaps. All right. Well, it looks like I didn't actually enter any data for these. So you don't see any data in terms of the orders and products for these customers. But when they were onboarded, we did create the tables for them. So if we went back, I could be ambitious here and go and try to enter some data and see if we could get that going. But for now, let's keep going through the services so we don't run out of time on the overarching. So Jillian, I mean, does that make sense in terms of how the data is partitioned for these different tenants, both for the pooled and for the siloed? Or do you have any questions that jump to mind?
This is just like mind blowing. Being able to actually see it like this, because I know so many startups that I hear when I talk to them, and I get it too when I'm trying to help startups as well. It's getting that more clarity on really what does it really look like from every part of the architecture that allows you to be able to enforce multi-tenancy. And I know part of that is especially concerns with startups of like, I'm going after enterprises. How do I make sure that this is going to be like secure and no noisy neighbors, as an example?
Yes.
And so I think seeing the little details. Go ahead.
And that noisy neighbors is a great transition. I don't know if you meant to do that, but that actually goes to the next service we want to show, because right, that's perfect. Because when we're thinking about the experience, say, well, it's great if you have shared data, or maybe your customers allow you to, maybe they don't. We can make different choices there. But there's also, you know, if they're sharing the same infrastructure, are we in any way degrading those enterprise customers' experience? Because let's say they're paying a higher amount. They want to have dedicated resources for them. You know, perhaps your pooled customers are willing to take a little bit of latency, and, you know, they're not paying that much, even free tier. We say, okay, well, you guys get the last feed of the trough, right? We're not going to prioritize your experience. But API gateway is another point where we actually start to see a difference in terms of how we support these silo customers versus the pooled customers. And again, that ID, that same ID that we just saw. So you might not remember it. I should have called out a number, but 44C1D, right? So if we look back over here at our tables, you'll see that same number continue to repeat as we look at these different services, because they've used the same tenant GUID across the different services to indicate that these are silo resources. So not only do those silo customers get their own DynamoDB tables, they also get their own API gateways. So this means, again, noisy neighbor problems at API gateway are particularly prevalent, right? Like at API gateway as a shared resource, We can set up specific quotas in terms of how we want to choke down specific customers and the amount of traffic they can have. But for enterprise customers, I don't want them to ever see, too much load on the system, try back later, right? That's not something our enterprise customers expect to see. So we've created these dedicated API gateways so that they get their own pools of resources and that they're not in any way subject to noisy neighbor problems, at least at the API gateway level, right? So this is another point where we can make these sort of decisions in terms of, hey, are these shared resources? Is there any potential for any sort of noisy neighbor problems? And so there's a couple domains we're already talking about. There's the data isolation domain, our data partitioning, which is more of a security question. Are your customers comfortable with their data being commingled with other customers' data? Do you need to have separate encryption keys for the data? Those type of security questions evolve at that level. On the other hand, at the API gateway level, now we start to think about noisy neighbors and tenant experience. What's that experience like? Is it as smooth and consistent as they want it to be? Are we able to offer different types of experiences and promise a higher SLA to certain customers, for example? Because that is another topic of conversation. What do your customers expect from you? And what's in a contract saying that you have to provide it or you're going to owe them money? Because that's a whole nother ballgame of conversation, right? Because if we're obligated to provide a response within a second or 2 seconds, and if we don't, we're in breach of contract. That's a very different conversation from preference, right?
Yeah, so fascinating. So in that case, in the actual Lambda function, is that where you're taking that actual tenant ID that you showed us before, and you're deciding, okay, if this is a enterprise premium customer, you route them to this DynamoDB table. If they're the free tier, route them to this customer?
Yeah. So all of that is done at our Lambda layer. And I will break out some codes. So I'm not just waving my hands here showing you guys the console. We'll look at a little bit of code. I'd love to get into detail on all of these. What I'll probably focus on specifically is the security around the shared model here.
Okay, awesome.
So I do want to get down to that point because you step it up on a soapbox for a second. We talked about tenant isolation in the beginning. And you might say something like, hey, I'm a new startup. Which one should I do? Should I do silo? Should I do pooled? There's a lot of answers to that question. One of my answers to that question are pooled is great. Make sure that you can secure your tenant isolation in pooled, absolutely bulletproof if you're going to go in that direction. I don't want to see a model where, well, we decided to go pooled, but we didn't really bake tenant isolation in at runtime. We're counting on our developers not to make mistakes. It's fine, because the blast radius of that in a SaaS solution is drastic, right? If you accidentally leak tenant data from one tenant to another, that could be the end of days for any SaaS startup, right? You can easily lose those customers, or you could find yourself on the front page of Reddit as another data leak in a SaaS application. And now you're famous for all of the wrong reasons, right?
But none of the startups here, because they're listening to these best practices here.
Exactly.
Bill, I think you kind of teased with this code because Victor said, let's see some code. So I think absolutely maybe we should, let's see it.
All right. So let me stop sharing that and I'll switch gears. Again, there's a lot of practices in the code that I won't get all the way into, but there's at least one part of this that I think we really can dig into. It has a lot of meat on this bone. Again, this is another topic we spend an hour talking about on any given day with specific customers. So this will be a high level. I won't give you all of the details about how this works. And there's also a number of options to how this could be implemented. So this is one option for how we could possibly think about implementing tenant isolation at runtime. So let me tell you what you're looking at right now. This is the code behind a Lambda Authorizer that's attached to our API gateway. Now, not everyone in the audience is going to be familiar with the Lambda Authorizer, but we saw that we were using an API gateway. I'm not going to bring that up again right now. We can go back and look at what the Lambda Authorizer looks like. But a Lambda Authorizer is just a Lambda that's sitting on all of our requests coming through our API gateway, intercepting them, and determining what to do with them, perhaps enriching them, perhaps blocking them if they don't meet a certain condition. But it's a really neat tool, especially for multi-tenancy, but for all sorts of different applications, to allow us to intercept requests and do specific processing on them. So if you're not using Lambda authorizers today, it's an important topic that you should be aware of if you're doing any form of serverless. It's a really nice tool that provides you a lot of different windows to access your requests coming in and do different things to them. For our purposes, though, the main thing that this code is doing is security, right? So this is going to enforce our tenant isolation. Sorry, Jillian.
I just realized I was muted. Sorry. Yeah, before we get into the code, Victor asked a really great question that I want to make sure that we address. So for customers who want to get their data from your SaaS API for in-house data engineering, does the API gateway also route those requests?
Do you want to take that one, Ben, or you want me to take it?
Go ahead, Bill. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I mean, it absolutely can be useful for in-house. I mean, if you're building a SaaS application, Victor, I'm going to make some assumptions. If you're building a SaaS application where your tenants and your customers are inside your own company, still treating it exactly the same way and saying, I'm going to build my SaaS application just like I would for anything else is a great solution. Now, you say data engineering. And data makes me think specifically about the size of the payloads. So there are going to be some concerns you want to have in terms of how big the payloads are that are coming back. If you're talking about large data sets, you might have to do some sort of shuffling around, perhaps providing links to S3 to download the data or to get to the data if in fact the data is too large for an API gateway. But it's still a really good starting point. And there's a couple patterns out there that you can find readily in terms of creating some links to S3, some temporary links to S3, so that they can get to that data if it's too large for API gateway to handle itself.
And Bill, just add as well, if you have a local kind of data engineering API gateway, you can bump up all the quotas and rate limiting. So, kind of limiting what your engineers can do.
Good call out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and API gateway is a great solution. I will step back. API gateway is not the only way to do everything. Like, I don't want to sell it as, hey, if you're doing an API, it's the only way. There certainly are other tools to do this. If you're using containers behind the scenes, you might have an ingress gateway and not be using an API gateway. So this isn't this isn't the hammer in the world of nails. Like, there's lots of different tools out there for the right job. API gateway is a great tool, though. It provides a lot of convenience in terms of how you can set these paths up and manage them, especially in a multi-tenant application, though. So good tool, not the tool for everything, at least. Hopefully that helps, Victor. Should we go back to the code then?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
That was a great question, Victor. So I'm glad we got that. And but please keep going.
Yeah, excellent question. So I'm going to jump right to the heart of this code. Whenever we talk about any form of dynamic policy generation or using IAM to enforce policies at runtime, it's almost always going to involve STS and assuming roles. So this is what you're seeing here. This is what I've highlighted. I'll take a step back in a second to talk about how we got here, but this is the heart of things. Like, this is jumping right to the end of the book. This is what's going to happen is at the end of this, most of you are probably familiar with the credentials that you get to log into AWS, right? Your access key and your secret key, you use those to log into AWS. Those saved credentials are what we use to go to the AWS SDK and retrieve data from S3 or call DynamoDB. So all we're really doing here is taking, remember that JOT token? You remember that ugly thing I showed you a while ago and has a tenant inside of it? This is really just the process of exchanging that JOT token for AWS credentials that we can use to access data with restrictions on what those credentials can do baked into the policies that we're going to generate. So that really, at a high level, is what dynamic policy generation means. It's a very advanced topic, but I think you can think about it that simply, right? Does that make sense, Jillian?
So I've had this exact question from another customer too. So I'm so glad that you're going over this because I think a common thing that sounds like a lot of early stage startups when they're thinking about building SaaS is, okay, do I create an IAM policy for every single tenant? Right. And it sounds like this dynamic policy creation is really the way to address that.
It can be. It may not. Again, there's a lot of different tools out there. This isn't the sole hammer of the world, but it does have some nice advantages. Instead of creating all of those different IAM artifacts, having to manage those artifacts, and even potentially running into quota limits again of like 5,000 IAM roles per account, especially if you're in a shared construct where that could be a legitimate concern. This provides a nice workaround around a lot of those problems, the overhead that you face, and the potential to running into quotas. And it's nice and convenient, but you could. It doesn't mean that this is the only way to do it, especially as an early stage startup. You still could go create a role per tenant. There's no reason you couldn't. And then simply look up that role at runtime and say, give me the role for Ben as a tenant, give me Bill's role as a tenant. So this is one way to do these things. It's very convenient and it provides a lot of benefits. But, talk to your account SA, find out what the right solution is for how to do these things if you're a SaaS customer, or reach out and ask. SaaS Factory is also here to help, and we're available to your account SAs if you ever want to talk to us about specific topics like this. And again, I'll talk to you about this for an hour. We only have an hour total today, so I don't want to totally geek out on this, but I am happy to follow up with anyone who's interested on this topic for sure. So again, being sort of time aware here, I don't want to dive too deep on this. I will say, hey, we got that JOT token in. Up above here in the code, we extracted the tenant identity out of that JOT token. That's the power of JOT tokens, is they're verifiable, and I can guarantee that the JOT token wasn't messed with by anybody. So when it says, hey, Bill is the tenant, I can guarantee that Bill is the tenant that's coming in, making the specific call into my API gateway. Now I set up permissions that say, hey, I'm going to let Bill only have permissions to the specific resources that Bill should have permission to. And we, again, do this in code. And in the case of this specific applications, I'll show you this IAM condition here. So this is an IAM policy, right? So if you're familiar with IAM already, this should look pretty familiar. This says, hey, and I'll read this sort of top to bottom for you. I'm going to allow the tenant that's coming in, Bill in this case, to update, get, put, or query DynamoDB. I'm going to allow him to get to specific tables. And now this one here is for tenant admin. So let me pick one that's a general user. So this would be the product table, for example. This might make a little bit more sense for me as Bill as a tenant, as opposed to thinking about what my admins can do. Bill can get to the product table, and we're going to add in his specific account, but only for the conditions where, and now this is going to be a little bit hard to read because this is string matching and replacing, right? So if you're familiar with like string templatization, it's going to plug in my tenant ID in here. So it says, hey, I'm only going to allow Bill to get access to his product, shared product table, where the leading key. So remember how we looked at that shard ID in the beginning of the table, way back when we were looking at DynamoDB, where that matches Bill's ID. So this is the magic. This is where all of that tenant isolation really comes into play and the gears click in. I took my JOT token, I extracted that tenant identifier off of it, and I injected it into this policy. Now, when I go as a programmer and I call the DynamoDB SDK and say something like this, right? So this is my order service data access layer. I'm going to say, hey, take the credentials that I already have and apply them to this call, so that when I call DynamoDB, if Bill is the tenant and I accidentally try to call and retrieve Ben's data, IAM is going to block me from doing that. And this is the real power of dynamic policy generations, and where if you're doing any sort of shared construct, it can be so valuable. Hopefully, I mean, Jillian, I mean, you've probably seen some of this before, but proxying for our customers who are on the call. Does this make sense to you so far?
This is just like so amazing to actually like see this. And a curious question I had about the dynamic policy generation. So when you say it's dynamic, so is that only live for the duration of the actual session of like the IAM role session?
Question. Perfect question. Absolutely. Going back to that STS, SDS, you can limit it down. The assumed role will last as long as you tell it to. Up to 24 hours might be the upper limit. It's in that range, but it can be as little as 15 minutes, right? So you can restrict it to quickly expire, or you can let it live a little bit longer. For most SaaS applications, the shorter the better, right? I mean, really, you want to keep it as limited as possible in case anyone gets for some reason has access to this token and they want to be able to get to resources they shouldn't have access to, that expires as quickly as it can. So make it as short as it can possibly be based on what you need.
Yeah, there was actually a question that just came in related to this topic from someone on LinkedIn. And it's like, maybe if you can add a little bit more clarity, or maybe if Ben, if you know. So if there's a hard limit on the number of IAM policies allowed to create per account, and if policies through dynamic policy creation are created dynamically, how does that be handled? It sounds like maybe that answer was with STS, or is there something else?
Yeah, so my understanding, there are restrictions on the number of IAM policies per account. So Bill, do you know the hard number?
So policies, I'm not sure about. Roles, I think, are 5,000, if I remember right. Again, like all these like the quizzes about limits and quotas always kind of get me. But 5,000 roles are the one people are more likely to run into than anything with policies anyway. But in answer to the second part of the question, these are not actually IAM policies that we're creating. They're treated as IAM policies when we inject them into STS. If we went to IAM, so if we ran this code right now and we went over to IAM, you would never see these policies in IAM. They're never actually created as an IAM policy. Rather, STS says, hey, I'm going to create this little temporary token based on what looks like an IAM policy from my perspective, but it doesn't actually exist. And then you only have a single role that is used to assume all of these policies. So the role itself is very permissive. So the role will have a policy attached to it that says, well, we're going to allow you to do whatever in DynamoDB. And what we're actually doing is scoping down that role's permissions to only what we say here. So we're saying, okay, the role in general could do anything with DynamoDB. But at runtime, we're going to say, Ben can only access Ben's table or this shared table even, where Ben is in that first column. And that's all we're going to allow him access to. So it really, if you're having any sort of limit or quota issues in terms of IAM, this will resolve most of those for you, I think. Good question, though. Really good.
Yeah, I love that question.
Yeah. So that's a lot of what I wanted to show. I really wanted to double click on this dynamic policies. There's a lot more in this. I mean, this is a full architecture, right? So we could talk about the onboarding processes. We could talk about all this different code that's over here on the left-hand side about how we update tenants, about how we onboard new tenants, how we offboard tenants. We have some really interesting, shared constructs in here. Like we use the Lambda Power tools to do logging and metrics, which is also valuable for SaaS. But again, this is a whole nother hour we could spend talking about it. So let's sort of end the demo there and say that's where we are with the serverless reference architecture. Go check it out. Feel free to ask us questions if you want to get deeper in it, or go check it out on Building SaaS on AWS, where we've recorded a lot longer sessions about it.
Yeah, that I know helped me a lot. And I know that from my conversations with startups that I think them watching this or going through this architecture is definitely really going to answer a ton of questions, especially on the multi-tenancy and how do you actually implement it.
Yeah.
So for everyone, that is an AWS Samples. It's a GitHub repo. I put a link to it on Twitch, but if you go to AWS Samples and if you search for just SaaS solution serverless, I'll post it again because I know there's some people who came in, but you'll be able to find that on GitHub. So I also want to be able to end with Ben, in your experience with startups, what makes a good SaaS startup? Because there's so many different things beyond just the actual implementation that really startups have to think about.
So probably the biggest is just really providing that streamlined onboarding experience and like reducing all the friction for customers to kind of sign up, evaluate, and subscribe. So I see a lot of startups really focus on their onboarding experience and just to try and reduce any friction points whatsoever to get customers onboarded. I think it's important as well having really clear subscription plans and billing terms, and not to kind of hide behind contact us for pricing. Just be really upfront with your SaaS subscription model and make it easy for people to cancel as well. I think if you're create too many roadblocks around that. It creates unnecessary kind of customer friction. Probably on the engineering side, just trying to simplify the deployment process. So having a really good CI/CD pipeline set up that you can deploy to test, staging, and roll out to production like multiple times a day. I think that really excites like engineers to get things done and ship products. So it's definitely a common pattern I see with good SaaS startups. And on the AWS side, just been really clever how you optimize your AWS resources. So not over provisioning resources, like having the largest RDS you can have, or over provisioning Dynamo, for example. Getting frequent touch points with your solutions architect around custom optimization sessions. So going through what to tune.
I love that. And there's probably startups here who are in the audience who maybe the actual startups, the SaaS business model and is really new to them. So what are some metrics that you recommend to startups to start to be able to look at as they're building their business?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it's called the Pirate Metrics by Dan McGaw from 500 Startup fame. So as a founder, I've really loved his kind of approach to running a SaaS company. So the R metrics really touch on like acquisition, activation of customers, really importantly, the retention, referral. So that trying to kickstart that viral loop in your app by people referring others. And kind of the last and the most important as well is revenue. So I do see some early stage startups maybe focus on some vanity metrics, like too much, focusing on the number of acquisitions they have, but not being really diligent, like that whole R metrics funnel, and understanding, where people drop off, the retention, and really trying to tune that referral engine as well. So highly recommend founders check out the R Pirate Metrics by Dan McGraw.
Oh, so good. I have learned so much from both of you this session. I know I'm going to be watching it again. And for everyone, every single week, these live sessions, they're actually going to go onto YouTube. So I know for me, I'm going to watch it again to make sure I get all of the different nuggets of wisdom that Bill and Ben just shared here. So make sure you check that out. We've got a few minutes left. So Bill, any last piece of advice for startups that are starting to build a SaaS business on AWS?
Yeah, I mean, we already covered a lot of really great ones. The metrics are really key. Make sure you're gathering your metrics. I'll maybe double click on one particular type of metric, and that's cost metrics.
Yes.
I've spent a lot of time talking about that this year. When you start to share resources, it gets harder and harder to differentiate your tenant costs and your feature costs. Starting to emit metrics early that can help you to sort of detangle those after the fact. Like, it's one thing to be able to tag your resources or put them in a separate account. What happens when we do what we were looking at today, and you've got all these shared resources? The only way to really measure those and to be able to understand your tenant costs is to emit metrics that talk about those costs so that you can put them together later. There's third-party solutions out there that can help you do that. You don't have to build it yourself. And I won't go into detail on those, but they're out there. You'll be able to find them pretty easily. But emitting the metrics is a required step for all of them. There's no magic formula for being able to see those costs. You have to be able to emit metrics for your shared costs, or else you're never going to be able to get back to breaking down to cost or feature-based tenants. Just a little bit of a soapbox item for me, that's all.
Oh, so good. Ben, any last words of advice for startups that are building their SaaS business on AWS?
Yeah, I think at the moment, kind of the current market, cost optimization is really front of mind. So seeing a lot of customers jump onto our Graviton kind of ARM instances and really kind of optimizing their compute stack. And seeing a lot of startups as well get onto the Golang and the Rust bandwagon. So rewriting core parts of their applications in more performant languages. It's kind of nice.
So good. Oh, Bill, Ben, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise on SaaS and startups. And thank you to everyone here who joined us live. We are live every single Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 4 a.m. Australia time zone. If you've got topics that you want to be able to hear on AWS On Air for the Startup Show, you can hit me up on Twitter at Miss Jill Ford. Thank you so much for being here today with me, and I can't wait to see you next Tuesday.
Awesome.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for the invite.